Picture this. A woman has been blind for 11 years. Not dim vision, not blurred shapes, completely, totally, permanently blind. 3 specialists in London have confirmed it. Scar tissue on both retinas, irreversible. She has learned to navigate her kitchen by touch, has memorized the number of steps from her front door to the garden gate, has stopped dreaming in images, because even her dreams have gone dark. She is sitting in a wooden chair in a church hall in Edinburgh, Scotland. The year is 1925. The hall smells like coal smoke and wet wool. Around her, perhaps 400 people have packed in so tightly that the ushers have given up and simply opened the back doors, so the overflow crowd can stand in the street and listen. The man on the platform has never seen her before. He does not know her name. He has traveled here from Bradford, England, a city he has barely left in years, and he knows no one in this room. He stops mid-sentence. He points toward the back of the hall, toward where she is sitting with her husband's hand on her arm. There is a woman here who has been blind for 11 years. The Lord says to tell her, your sight is not gone. It is merely waiting. 400 people hold their breath. The woman grips her husband's wrist. She has heard healers before. She has been prayed for more times than she can count. She has stopped hoping. But something is different in this room tonight. Something she cannot explain. The man on the platform says simply, open your eyes, and she does, and she sees. The doctors at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary examined her the following week. They found no scar tissue, no damage. Retinas completely clear as if they had never been touched by disease. One of them wrote in her file in his careful physician's hand. No medical explanation can be offered for this recovery. The woman called it a miracle. The 400 witnesses called it a miracle. The overflow crowd standing in the wet Edinburgh street called it a miracle. But here is what none of them saw, the years that preceded that moment. The grief, the bankruptcy, the loneliness so complete it nearly swallowed a man whole, the price that had been paid in the dark, in silence, with no audience and no applause, long before any miracle ever happened. This is the story of George William Jeffreys, a man who began with nothing, and that is not a figure of speech. Born in poverty so grinding that food was a question, not a certainty. A man who could not speak without stammering so badly that strangers looked away. A man who buried more than any person should ever have to bury and kept walking. A man who lit a fire across Britain so bright that the newspapers called him the most remarkable religious figure of the 20th century, and then watched everything he built collapse around him, betrayed by the very institution he had created. A man who proved that God does not call the polished. He calls the broken. A man who proved that the fire God gives does not come cheap. By the time you finish this story, you will have to answer a question. Are you willing to pay what he paid? George William Jeffreys was born on February 28, 1889, in Maesteg, a coal mining town tucked into the valleys of South Wales, not the Wales of green hills and castle postcards. The Wales of black dust and 6-day work weeks, and fathers who came home so exhausted they sometimes fell asleep at the table before the meal was finished. His father, Thomas Jeffreys, was a miner. So were most of the men in Maesteg. The valley had been carved open for coal decades before George was born, and it would swallow men for decades after. The Jeffreys house was a terrace row cottage, 2 rooms downstairs, rooms above, no indoor plumbing, no heating beyond the fireplace, and more children than the house was built to hold. George was the 4th of 7. There was almost never enough of anything. What made George's childhood particularly cruel was not just the poverty, it was his body. From the time he could speak, he stammered. Badly. The kind of stammer that makes sentences into ordeals, that makes other children imitate you in the schoolyard, that makes teachers move on to the next student because they cannot wait. He would stand at the front of the class and feel the words lock up behind his teeth like stones in a pipe, and the silence would stretch, and the other boys would snicker, and the teacher's patience would visibly drain from her face. He hated to speak. He avoided it whenever he could. He was 12 when his father began to show signs of the illness that would take him. Black lung. The coal dust had been settling into Thomas Jeffreys' chest for 2 decades, and now it was collecting its payment. The man who had worked before dawn every morning of George's life began to slow, then to cough so hard at night that the whole house heard it, then to stay home from the mine on days he could not breathe. George watched his father diminish. He watched his mother, Kezia, stretch what little money they had into shapes it was never meant to take. He watched his older brothers take on extra work, and he took on extra work too, running errands, doing whatever a 12-year-old with a stammer and a desperate face could find to do. Thomas Jeffries died when George was 15. There was no ceremony of grief the family could afford to fall into. Within the week, the older children had sorted out which jobs each of them would take. Within the month, the house had recalibrated around the absence. You learned to do that in Maesteg. You carried it and kept moving. George went to work in a draper's shop, folding fabric, measuring ribbon, speaking as little as possible to the customers who came in. He was good with his hands, careful with figures, quiet in the way that people with a stammer learn to be quiet. Always 2 sentences ahead, calculating which words he could reach without the stammer swallowing him. He was 17 when his older brother Stephen came home from a revival meeting in town with a look on his face that George had never seen before. Stephen had always been the steady one, the practical one, the one who calculated everything before he moved. But that night, he sat across the kitchen table from George and said something that cracked open a door George hadn't known existed. "Something happened to me tonight," Stephen said. "I cannot explain it. But I felt something I have never felt in my life. Like standing in a river of light." George went the next night, more to understand what had happened to his brother than out of any expectation of his own. The meeting was held in a rented hall above a furniture shop. The preacher was no one famous. The singing was ordinary. The room was cold, but something happened to George Jeffries that night. It was not an emotional surge. It was not the warmth of a crowd or the power of suggestion. It was something quieter and more devastating than that. He sat in that wooden chair and felt, for the first time in his 17 years on earth, that someone knew him, not his stammer, not his dead father, not his poverty. Him. The person underneath all of it. He walked home afterward and did not tell anyone what had happened. He was 17 and he stammered and he worked in a draper's shop and he had no category for what he was feeling. But something had changed at a level he could not name. 3 weeks later, he tried to speak at a small prayer meeting. 7 people in someone's front room. He stood up, opened his mouth, and the stammer took him. The words locked, the silence stretched. He felt the heat rise in his face, and then, slowly, something released. He began to speak, not fluently. He would never be what anyone called fluent, but words came, sentences came. He said what was in him to say, and when he sat down, one of the older men looked at him with an expression he had never received before. Not pity, not impatience. Attention. "You should keep doing that," the man told him. George was not sure that was possible. But he kept doing it. The years between 18 and 25 were the years of building. George and Stephen Jeffries began holding meetings together, first in homes, then in rented halls, then in larger spaces as more people came. They traveled the Welsh valleys with no money, no car, no organization behind them. They walked when they had to. They slept in the homes of families who had heard them preach and offered a spare room. They ate what they were given. George prayed through entire nights, not as a spiritual exercise, not as a discipline he had been taught. He prayed because he was terrified. Every time he stood up to speak, the stammer was still there, waiting for him, and the only thing that made it bearable was the hour, or the 2 hours, or the entire night he had spent on his face before a God he was still learning to believe would not abandon him. He fasted regularly, not the occasional skip-a-meal fast. Weeks. He would eat nothing for 3 days, sometimes 5, sometimes longer, then break the fast with bread and water and go back to praying. He was 20 years old, burning with something he could barely contain and could not fully explain, and the price was extraction of everything comfortable. He turned down opportunities that other young men in his position would have seized. A chapel in Cardiff offered him a settled pastorate, a salary, a congregation, a house, stability, everything the son of a dead coal miner should have wanted. He turned it down. The word of knowledge he had received, the thing he could barely articulate even to himself, was that he was not supposed to settle. He was supposed to move. He did not know yet how much that word would cost him. In 1915, at age 26, he founded the Elim Evangelistic Band with a handful of other young preachers. The name came from the oasis in the book of Exodus, 12 springs, 70 palm trees, a resting place in the wilderness. They traveled, they preached, they held open-air meetings in market squares, while shopkeepers watched, with varying degrees of skepticism and hostility. They prayed for the sick. They planted churches wherever people responded. The miracles began quietly. A man in Monaghan, Ireland, who had walked with a severe limp for 8 years straightened up during a prayer meeting and walked normally. A woman in Belfast who had been deaf in one ear since a childhood fever heard a whisper spoken from 10 feet away. Each account came with witnesses. Each account was verified by people with no motive to fabricate it. Word spread. It always does. By the early 1920s, George Jeffreys was preaching to crowds that could not fit into the buildings available. He rented theaters. He rented town halls. He rented the largest spaces he could find, and packed them with people who had heard something extraordinary was happening and wanted to see for themselves. The Edinburgh service where the blind woman received her sight was one of hundreds of such nights during these years. There were thousands of documented healings, deaf ears opened, crippled limbs restored. Cancers that specialists had declared terminal went into complete remission. In Belfast, he held a campaign at which so many people were healed in a single service that the city's newspaper sent 2 reporters to investigate, certain they would find a con. Both reporters wrote accounts that could not explain what they had witnessed. George himself, in his private moments, was always unsettled by it. He did not experience the miracles as power flowing out of him. He experienced them as something flowing through him from somewhere else. And the sensation of being a conduit for something that large was as frightening as it was humbling. He would finish a service in which a dozen people had received healings and go backstage and sit with his head in his hands, shaking, depleted to a level that sleep alone could not repair. He never told the crowds this part. He told them only what they needed to know, that God was real, that God was present, and that God had not finished moving in the world. He said it in sentences that still sometimes caught and stammered and then released, and the crowds loved him more for it because it proved he was not performing. A performer would have fixed the stammer. George Jeffreys had never fixed the stammer. He had only kept speaking. Have you ever built something with your bare hands? Not a house or a cabinet. Something that required years and sacrifice and risk and faith that felt insane even as you maintained it. Have you ever watched something take shape from nothing, stone by stone, knowing that every stone had cost you personally? George Jeffreys built the Elim Pentecostal Church from nothing into one of the largest evangelical movements Britain had ever seen. By 1926, there were over 200 Elim churches across the United Kingdom and Ireland. By the 1930s, the number had tripled. He preached at the Royal Albert Hall in London. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly, filling one of the most prestigious venues in the country, with working-class Britons and miners' daughters and factory workers who had never set foot in such a building before, who had been told all their lives that faith was for other people, for educated people, for people with a different accent and a different postcode. He told them it was for them. He meant it. But here is what the crowds at the Royal Albert Hall never saw. Here is what history tends to skip past because it is harder to narrate than the miracles. The financial cost. George Jeffreys drew no personal salary from Elim for years. He lived on whatever was given to him directly, often very little. He owned almost nothing. He wore the same suit so many times that close friends who traveled with him began quietly replacing his clothes without comment, simply leaving a new shirt in his bag when the old one had worn through. He traveled by train in 3rd class while the Elim organization, which he had founded, began to accumulate institutional weight and institutional money. He held crusades that generate significant offerings, wrote them over to the organization, and went home to a rented room. He was not bitter about this. He had chosen it. He had chosen at every turn to pour into the thing rather than to take from it. The emotional cost. He carried a loneliness that almost no one saw. The stammer had shaped him into a person who communicated in public, before thousands, with more ease than he communicated one-to-one. There were relationships he wanted and could not sustain. There was a particular kind of deep, quiet companionship he craved and almost never had. He was surrounded constantly by crowds, by co-workers, by the endless logistical demands of a growing movement, And he was, in the room no one else could enter, profoundly alone. He had never married. There was a reason he did not speak about often. In his mid-20s, there had been a young woman in Wales, a schoolteacher, dark-haired, steady, the kind of person who saw him not as a preacher but as a man. They had talked about a life together. She had waited while he traveled. She had waited a long time. And then the organization that was becoming a limb had decided that its leader needed to be entirely devoted, entirely available, entirely undivided. And he had agreed. He had written her a letter he never stopped wishing he had not written. He did not speak of her by name to anyone, but those who knew him well could see it in him sometimes. In the way he looked at families who arrived together at his crusades, the husband's hand on the small of the wife's back, children scrambling between them. He would look for just a moment, and then he would look somewhere else. By the mid-1930s, Elim was an institution: churches, schools, a publishing house, a magazine, a Bible college. George had built it, stone by stone, the way his father had built a family on a miner's wage, by refusing to stop. And then came the decade that broke him. The conflict began over governance. George had always led Elim with a singular authority, not from ego, or not only from ego, but from the practical reality that movements need a center of gravity, and he was it. The miracles happened when he preached. The crowds came because of him. The organization had grown because of what God had done through him specifically, and he had led accordingly. But by the late 1930s, the Elim Leadership Council had grown large enough to have its own interests. The men on the council had not built what George had built. They had joined an existing structure and administered it, and over time they had begun to believe that the structure was the point. They wanted to democratize control, distribute authority, reduce George's singular influence over the direction of the movement. The argument, stated plainly, was reasonable. Large organizations need checks. No single person should be unchecked. These were not villainous men. But to George, who had given everything, who had walked dirt roads in rain to preach in borrowed halls so that these church buildings could exist, the proposal felt like a rearrangement of the furniture in a house he had built with his hands while he was still inside it. The conflict stretched across years. There were meetings. There were letters. There were moments of near resolution that collapsed. George continued to preach, continued to hold crusades, continued to operate in the supernatural gifts that had always defined his ministry. But the institutional body that carried his name was slowly, systematically being reshaped into something he did not recognize. In 1940, at the height of the Second World War, with Britain under blackout and the continent on fire and the future of everything uncertain, the Elim leadership voted to reorganize along the lines they had proposed. George was effectively sidelined from organizational authority in the movement he had founded. He was 51 years old. He did not take it quietly. He tried to hold on. He appealed. He argued. He prayed over it until the praying itself became a kind of grief. He watched men who had come into Elim long after he built it take positions of governance over what his life's work had produced. And then he did something that surprised everyone who knew him. He let go. Not gracefully. There is no graceful way to lose what you have built. But he let go. He founded a smaller organization. He continued to preach. He continued to hold healing campaigns, though smaller now, in halls that held hundreds rather than thousands. He did not publicly attack the Elim leadership. He did not campaign for sympathy. He said almost nothing publicly about what had happened, which was perhaps the most difficult thing he had ever done with his mouth. A mouth that had always been the instrument of his whole life. He simply kept going. There is something the critics of George Jeffreys have never been able to dispute. The miracles did not stop when the institution failed him. The healings did not stop when the organizational authority was stripped from him. The fire that had been with him since that prayer meeting in the hall above the furniture shop in Meisteg, that fire kept burning. In 1947, he held a campaign in a small church in Birmingham, 60 people. No reporters. No Royal Albert Hall acoustics. A woman came in on crutches, rheumatoid arthritis, diagnosed 5 years earlier, progressing relentlessly. She left without the crutches. 2 months later, her physician wrote a note to the church. The condition appears to have fully resolved. There is no medical explanation I can offer. In 1952, in a rented church hall in London, A man who had been told his heart was functioning at 30% capacity and who had been advised to avoid exertion came forward during a prayer service. George placed his hands on the man and prayed, simply the way he had always prayed. Not with elaborate language, not with theatrical presentation, but with the directness of someone who believed God was actually present and listening. The man's cardiologist, examining him 6 weeks later, found cardiac function in the normal range. He wrote to the man, "I cannot account for this." He was not a young man anymore. The stammer was still there. His hair had gone white. He moved more slowly, but there was something in him that age had not touched. A quality of attention, a quality of presence that made people in the same room feel they were being fully seen. The people who knew him in these later years described the same thing. A man at peace in a way that was not resignation. He had lost much. He knew it. He did not pretend otherwise. But he had not lost the essential thing, the thing that had found him in that hall above the furniture shop when he was 17. And he was clear-eyed enough to know that the essential thing was never about the buildings or the organization or the crowds. He had paid a price most people will not pay, and he had received something most people will never hold. He lived simply in the quiet of a small house, praying long hours in the mornings before the world woke up. He wrote. He preached wherever he was asked. He turned down offers of prestige and accepted a service. He did not try to rebuild what had been taken. He said once to a colleague who asked him if he ever regretted the split from a limb, "I regret only the days I held on too long. The moment I released it, I found I was free." On January 26, 1962, George William Jeffreys died in London. He was 72 years old. He died in a rented flat with a few close friends around him. No fanfare, no cathedral service, no official representatives from the organization he had founded. He had asked for simplicity. What he left behind was not simple. The Elim Pentecostal Church, the church that had sidelined him, the church he had not been able to recognize in its later institutional form, had by 1962 planted hundreds of churches across Britain and sent missionaries to dozens of countries. The theology he had carried from those Welsh Valley meetings, the belief in the present-day reality of healing and spiritual gifts, had spread into regions he had never visited, in languages he had never spoken. He had not built it for legacy. He had built it in obedience, stone by stone, through poverty and loneliness, and a stammer that never fully left him, and then he had given it away, first willingly, then unwillingly, then finally willingly again, and it had become something that outlived him by generations. The blind woman in Edinburgh lived until 1971. She attended church every Sunday of her remaining life. She never once stopped telling the story of the night she opened her eyes in that coal smoke hall and saw. Here is what the history books mention briefly, if at all. George Jeffreys could not afford to be buried with ceremony. The friends who had been with him at the end organized a quiet service. There was no monument. There was no official commemoration from a limb. There was only the record of what he had done, written in the lives of people who had been healed, and in the churches that stood in cities across Britain, and in the missionaries who carried the fire he had lit into the rest of the world. And there was this question which he would have wanted left on the table after he was gone. Not was he real? The documented healings settle that question for anyone willing to look. Not did he succeed. The breadth of what he built settles that question too. The question he would have left is the one he asked quietly in city after city, hall after hall, in his careful Welsh-accented voice with its occasional stammer, to people who had come looking for something they could not name. What are you willing to pay? Not for an organization, not for an institution, not for recognition or applause, or a seat at the table of the powerful, for the thing itself, the real thing, the fire that does not come for free. Are you willing to fast when the table is set for others? Are you willing to speak when your voice locks in your throat and the room is watching? Are you willing to build something beautiful and then release it when the time comes, even when the releasing breaks your heart? Are you willing to walk away from the comfort that was offered, because you heard something calling you further out? George William Jeffreys walked away from every comfort he was offered. He walked toward the harder thing every time. And every time he did, the fire got brighter. The question is whether you'll do the same. Comment below with "I am willing" if you're ready to answer what God is calling you toward, no matter the cost. And if this story moved you, don't miss our next video. The story of a man who sold everything he owned, crossed an ocean with nothing but a Bible and a conviction, and turned an entire region of Africa upside down before he was 40. We'll see you there.